The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. Red light filled the small observation chamber, bouncing off metal walls that had not changed color in 30 years of silence. I had been assigned to this post since I was young, watching a single blue planet from a hidden station tucked behind the ice moon at the edge of its system. Nothing ever happened here. That was the point. We watched, we recorded, we did not act. That was the rule carved into every observer who ever sat in this chair. My name is Corvain Eighth, and until that moment, my life had been simple. I logged radio signals. I cataloged strange broadcasts full of music and arguments, and something the humans called comedy. I wrote reports that nobody above my rank ever read closely, because Earth was considered a closed file, a species too young and too dangerous to be let near the wider galaxy. The Council had decided long ago that humanity's broadcasts, full of conflict and noise, made them unfit for contact. So we watched from a distance, like scientists studying something behind glass, never touching, never speaking. I remember reaching for the alarm controls with hands that were shaking slightly, though I told myself it was just static interference. The screen in front of me showed a new signal, one that did not belong to Earth. It was old code, Council code, the kind used by fleet vessels that had no business being anywhere near a quarantine system. I ran the signal twice to be sure. Both times it came back the same. A ship, not human, not Council authorized, moving quietly through the outer edge of the solar system, running dark, avoiding detection from Earth's limited defense satellites, but not from mine. Whoever they were, they knew the system was watched. They just did not expect anyone still awake at this post to notice them slip through. I sat back and tried to breathe normally. My orders were clear. Observe, report, never interfere. I had followed those orders for years without difficulty, because nothing ever tested them. Now, for the first time, my hands hovered over the communication panel, unsure whether I was about to break protocol or simply do my job. I chose to report first. The transmission took several minutes to reach Council relay stations, bouncing through hidden channels built for observers like me. While I waited, I turned my attention back to the planet itself, magnifying the visual feed until continents came into focus, followed by cities, followed by the small dots of moving vehicles and lights that never seemed to fully go dark, even at night. I had watched humans argue about nearly everything. I had watched them fight wars among themselves, build machines that could level cities, then turn around and build hospitals to heal each other from disease. I had listened to their music, strange and layered, sometimes gentle, sometimes loud enough to make my ears ring even through a filtered feed. I had read transcripts of their politicians shouting at one another in chambers filled with reporters, then watched those same politicians shake hands afterward as if nothing had happened. It confused every analyst who ever studied them. Every report before mine described humanity as unstable, unpredictable, dangerous. I had believed that too, once, but the longer I watched, the more I noticed something the reports never mentioned. Whenever something truly threatened them, whether it was a storm, a disease, or a disaster of their own making, humans stopped arguing. They organized. They moved together with a speed and coordination that no other young species in Council records had ever shown. It was almost as if their conflict was only the surface, and underneath it sat something else entirely, something patient, something that only woke up when it needed to. I never mentioned this observation in my official reports. It felt too strange to write down, too easy to dismiss as imagination. But sitting in that chair, watching an unmarked ship creep toward a planet that had no idea what was coming, I found myself thinking about it again. The response from Council Relay finally arrived, delayed by the usual layers of bureaucracy. It confirmed what I already feared. The vessel was not registered to any sanctioned mission. It matched known configurations belonging to a species called the Tremble, an expanding, ambitious people who had grown tired of Council restrictions on colonization. They believed Earth, rich in resources and defenseless against real interstellar power, was an easy target hidden behind a quarantine that no one enforced anymore. I typed my report with more urgency than I had ever used before. Unauthorized vessel detected. Possible hostile intent toward quarantine system. Requesting immediate guidance. I sent it through every channel available to me, then waited, staring at the screen as the seconds became minutes. While I waited, the Tremble vessel grew closer to Earth's outer defenses, still running dark, still undetected by any human instrument. I zoomed my feed toward the ship, studying its outline. It was not a small scouting craft. It was built for landing forces, the kind of vessel used to establish a foothold on a planet's surface quickly, before any meaningful resistance could form. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely someone above me would respond immediately. Surely the Council, for all its caution, understood the difference between watching a quarantined species and allowing another species to conquer it uninvited. I told myself help was coming. I told myself this was simply a delay caused by distance and protocol, nothing more. An hour passed with no response. I thought briefly of contacting a colleague at a neighboring observation post, another observer named Fine Otral who monitored a system several light-years away, simply to share the weight of what I was witnessing. I decided against it, aware that any unnecessary transmission might draw attention I could not afford at such a critical moment, and instead turned back to the silent, patient work of documentation, alone with my thoughts and the glow of my instruments. I began recording everything with obsessive detail, partly out of duty, partly because I did not know what else to do. I watched the Tremble vessel adjust its course slightly, aiming for what appeared to be a quiet stretch of coastline on the planet's western continent. I zoomed in further and saw human cities glowing peacefully in the evening light, entirely unaware that anything unusual floated above them. For the first time in my career, I found myself wanting to break protocol. I wanted to send a warning directly to Earth, to override every rule I had followed since the day I first sat in this chair. My finger actually touched the panel that would have opened a direct channel to one of Earth's communication satellites. I held it there for a long moment, weighing consequences I could not fully calculate. Then my console lit up again, this time with an incoming message from the Council itself. I pulled my hand back and opened the transmission, hoping for orders that would finally make sense of everything happening around me. The message was short. It instructed me to continue observation only. No contact was authorized. No warning was to be given to the local population under any circumstances. The matter would be addressed through proper diplomatic channels once a full report had been reviewed by the appropriate committee. I read it twice, certain I had misunderstood something. There was no urgency in the words at all, no acknowledgement that a civilization was about to face an uninvited invasion while the people meant to protect galactic order debated procedure from a comfortable distance. I looked back at my screen. The Tremble vessel had begun its final descent, cutting through the atmosphere in a wide, careful arc, designed to avoid detection until the last possible moment. Below it, cities continued their evening routines, streets filling with light as darkness spread across that stretch of the world. Somewhere down there, ordinary people were finishing meals, walking home, laughing with friends, entirely unaware that the sky above them was no longer empty. I thought about every dismissive report I had ever read describing humans as too dangerous to approach. I thought about every warning that painted them as reckless and unpredictable, unworthy of contact until they proved themselves calmer, safer, more like us. And I thought about the quiet, coordinated instinct I had noticed buried beneath their noise, the one nobody else seemed to take seriously. For the first time since taking this post, I found myself hoping that the reports about their supposed instability were more accurate than the deeper pattern I believed I had seen. Because if I was wrong about them, this invasion would be over quickly, and quietly, in a way that would never trouble the Council's conscience. But if I was right, then the ship descending toward that unsuspecting coastline was about to discover something no report, no observer, and no committee had ever fully understood. I adjusted my recording equipment, widened my feed to cover the entire region, and settled back into my chair to watch, because that was still, technically, my only job. Before the vessel vanished from clear sight, I paused my recording long enough to check something that had nothing to do with my assignment. I searched through old personal notes I had kept over the years. Private observations never included in any official report. Small details about humanity that had struck me as curious rather than useful. I found an entry from many years earlier describing a moment when two rival human nations, locked in a bitter dispute over territory, had set aside their conflict within hours to coordinate rescue efforts after a natural disaster struck a region neither of them controlled. At the time, I had written it off as an isolated act of decency, unlikely to reflect any deeper pattern in their behavior. Sitting here now, watching an armed vessel descend toward an unsuspecting town, that old memory felt like the first thread of something I had never allowed myself to fully consider. I also thought about the countless recorded conversations between ordinary humans that filled the archives of my station, casual exchanges never meant for outside ears, filled with worry over small things, arguments over trivial matters, and yet always returning, again and again, to a quiet insistence on protecting the people closest to them. It was a trait so common across every recording I had ever reviewed that I had stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing the sound of their own breathing. Only now, faced with the reality of an actual invasion, did that quiet insistence begin to feel like something far larger than a passing cultural detail. I closed those old files and returned my full attention to the descending vessel, aware that whatever theories I had formed in the privacy of my own thoughts meant nothing until they were tested against reality. The Tremble ship continued its descent, confident and unhurried, entirely unaware that the observer watching its approach had already begun to doubt everything the Council believed it understood about the world below. The vessel disappeared below the cloud line, and the transmission from my station carried on, uninterrupted, into a silence that felt heavier than anything I had recorded in 30 years of watching that quiet blue world. The Tremble vessel touched down in a wide field just outside a quiet town called Marrow Hollow, nestled along the western coastline I had been watching for the past several hours. I zoomed my feed as close as my equipment allowed, catching the first moments of contact between two worlds that had never been meant to meet this way. Doors opened along the side of the massive vessel, and figures began stepping out onto human soil. They moved with confidence, the kind that comes from believing you have already won before the fight begins. I had seen this posture before, in old Council archives, footage of other conquests on other worlds, places where resistance crumbled within days because the invading force understood exactly how outmatched their targets were. The first human to notice them was a farmer named Peter Hale, walking his dog along the edge of that same field in the last hour of daylight. I watched him stop, tilt his head, and stare at the vessel with an expression that was not fear, but something closer to confusion mixed with disbelief. He did not run. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, the kind humans use to communicate instantly across long distances, and began speaking into it quickly. Within minutes, local authorities arrived, then regional ones. Then, faster than I expected, something changed in the tone of every transmission I intercepted. The confusion in human voices did not turn to panic the way Council reports always predicted it would. Instead, it hardened into something focused, something almost eerily calm. I listened to a woman named Grace Whitfield, a local emergency coordinator, giving instructions over the radio with a steady voice that betrayed no trace of fear. She organized evacuation routes for nearby homes while simultaneously requesting immediate contact with national defense forces. Her tone did not waver even once, and I found myself struck by how quickly she moved from surprise to action, as if some part of her had always expected a day like this might come. Meanwhile, the Tremble ground forces began establishing a perimeter around their landing site, setting up equipment that Council intelligence described as standard for planetary control operations. Their leader, a broad figure named Voss Kaith in Tremble records, addressed his troops with clear instructions to secure the area and prepare for a swift advance toward the nearest population center by morning. He believed, as every briefing I later reviewed confirmed, that a species without interstellar travel would collapse into disorganized fear the moment real strength was displayed. I transmitted everything I witnessed back to the council, message after message, each one more detailed than the last. Confirmed hostile landing, ground forces deploying, local population organizing faster than predicted models suggest, request immediate response. The reply, when it finally came hours later, offered nothing beyond continued observation. A formal review had been scheduled, committees were being assembled. Diplomatic protocols required careful consideration before any official council action could be authorized, especially regarding a species that remained, on paper, outside formal contact status. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling something uncomfortable settle in my chest. Down on that planet, an entire civilization was reacting to a threat with more discipline than my own government could summon in response to an unlawful invasion, and yet the people meant to protect galactic order were content to wait for paperwork. Through the night, I watched human military units begin arriving near Marrow Hollow, moving with a precision that unsettled the Threll scouts monitoring their approach. Reports intercepted from Threll communications described the buildup as disorganized and slow, evidence, in their eyes, of a species incapable of true coordination. I found myself doubting that assessment more with each passing hour. By dawn, the perimeter around the landing site had grown tense. Human forces, led by a commander named Edward Finch, held a defensive line just beyond visual range of the Threll encampment, careful not to provoke an immediate confrontation, while additional support mobilized from cities further inland. I listened to Finch coordinating with officials I recognized from earlier broadcasts, his voice calm but firm, giving orders that balanced caution with quiet resolve. The Threll, confident in their technological superiority, decided to test the boundary shortly after sunrise. A small unit advanced beyond their perimeter, intending to demonstrate strength and discourage further human buildup. What they encountered instead was a defensive response so immediate and precise that their scouts retreated within minutes, reporting unexpected resistance capability back to their commander. I replayed that exchange several times, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. Every prior report on human military capability described their weapons as primitive compared to interstellar standards. Yet the coordination behind their response, the speed of their communication, the way multiple units adjusted their positions almost instantly based on updated information, resembled tactics far more advanced than anything in the files I had access to. Voss Kaith, still confident despite the setback, ordered a full advance for the following night, believing that a larger show of force would finally break whatever resistance humanity intended to offer. I transmitted this development to the Council immediately, along with a growing sense of unease that I struggled to put into words within the formal structure of my reports. While I waited for a response that I suspected would never come quickly enough, I turned my attention to something I had never done before during my assignment. I began searching older human broadcasts, not for entertainment or casual observation, but for understanding. I studied historical records of past conflicts among their own nations, moments when smaller, less equipped forces had somehow outlasted larger, better armed ones through sheer adaptability and resolve. I studied their engineering advancements, their rapid development of new technology during moments of crisis, their strange ability to set aside internal disagreements the instant a shared threat appeared. The pattern I had only suspected before became impossible to ignore. Humanity's history was full of moments where outside observers assumed collapse was inevitable, only to watch them adapt in ways that defied every prediction. Their conflicts with each other, chaotic and loud as they seemed from a distance, had forged a kind of resilience that no other species in Council archives had ever needed to develop, because no other species had faced quite so many internal and external challenges within such a short span of their history. By the time night fell again over Marrow Hollow, human forces had multiplied far beyond their initial response, drawing in units from across the region under a coordinated command structure that seemed to strengthen with every passing hour rather than weaken. I watched supply lines forming, communication networks expanding, and something that looked less like panic and more like preparation for a fight they intended to win. The Threll advance began exactly as Voss Kaith ordered, ground forces moving forward, under cover of darkness, confident that their equipment would overwhelm any resistance long before serious losses occurred. I widened my feed to capture as much of the unfolding confrontation as possible, my hands steady now, though my mind raced with questions I had never expected to ask about a species I once considered simple to understand. As the first shots of that advance echoed across the quiet countryside, I found myself no longer certain which side truly held the advantage everyone assumed was obvious. The Threll believed victory was inevitable because they had faced dozens of young worlds before and never once failed to conquer them within days. But I had spent 30 years watching humanity in ways their invaders never had, and something in the calm, focused energy radiating from every human transmission told me this world might be the first exception to a rule the Threll had never bothered to question. I sent one final message to the Council before the confrontation fully began, knowing it would likely arrive too late to matter. "This is no longer a simple observation," I wrote. "This is a mistake the Threll are about to discover in the worst possible way, and we are choosing to watch it happen instead of preventing it." While I waited for a response that never arrived in time, I turned my attention to something happening far from Marrow Hollow that I had almost missed entirely. In a city several hundred kilometers inland, a woman named Margaret Blake, who worked as a communications officer for the National Defense Network, had intercepted fragments of the same signal that first alerted me to the Threll vessel days earlier. Her equipment was nowhere near as sophisticated as mine, yet she had noticed the anomaly through nothing more than careful attention and years of experience monitoring unusual frequencies. I watched her raise the alarm through official channels long before any human authority publicly acknowledged the presence of an outside threat, a detail that Council intelligence had entirely failed to anticipate. Humanity, it seemed, had been watching their own skies more closely than anyone outside their world ever gave them credit for. I also noticed how quickly information about the landing spread through unofficial channels, ordinary citizens sharing footage and rumors across their communication networks within minutes of the first sighting. Rather than causing widespread panic, as every Council model predicted for a species facing sudden contact with an unknown threat, this rapid spread of information seemed to accelerate their organized response instead. Local volunteers began arriving near the perimeter established by Commander Finch, offering support in whatever capacity they could provide, from medical assistance to simple logistical help moving supplies toward the front. It was not the chaotic scattering of a frightened population that every archive on first contact scenarios described. It was something closer to a community quietly falling into roles it seemed to have already rehearsed, even if no rehearsal had ever actually taken place. Not far from the perimeter, a young mother named Louise Carden organized several neighbors into an informal supply chain, moving food and blankets toward the growing number of volunteers gathering near the front line. Nobody had asked her to take on this role. She simply saw a need and filled it, coordinating with strangers as easily as if she had known them for years, a small but telling example of the same instinct for cooperation that seemed to appear everywhere I looked once I started paying proper attention to it. A retired engineer named Henry Doyle, living in a small house not far from the perimeter, spent the night studying broadcast reports about the situation and sketching rough diagrams based on decades of experience working with defense contractors earlier in his life. By morning, he had made his way to the command post and offered his analysis of the Threll vessel's likely weak points based on nothing more than visual observation and old professional instinct. I watched Commander Finch review his notes with the same seriousness he gave to reports from active military personnel, an openness to unconventional input that struck me as another quiet advantage no Threll strategist had ever considered possible from a civilian population under threat. As the hours passed and the Threll advance drew nearer, I found myself documenting not just the movement of troops and equipment, but the strange, steady rhythm of an entire community reorganizing itself around a single shared purpose. Farmers like Peter Hale returned to the perimeter with supplies rather than fleeing further inland. Local officials worked alongside military commanders without the friction I expected between civilian and defense authorities. Even children, evacuated to safer distances at Grace Whitfield's insistence, were kept informed with age-appropriate honesty rather than false reassurance, a choice that seemed to reduce fear rather than deepen it. No reply came before the first wave of the assault reached its peak, and for the first time in my career, I realized that whatever happened next on that battlefield would matter more than any report I could ever file afterward. The advance began with a wall of light cutting through the darkness above Marrow Hollow, Threll vessels rising from their landing site to sweep across the defensive line human forces had built through the night. I watched from my station with every sensor pushed to its limit, recording each movement, each decision, each shift in strategy from both sides as the confrontation unfolded faster than any report could have predicted. Commander Edward Finch had positioned his forces along a ridge overlooking the open field where the Threll camp sat, using the natural terrain to shield his troops from direct line of sight. I had studied enough Council archives of past conquests to know that Threll assault patterns relied heavily on overwhelming firepower delivered in the first moments of contact, designed to break enemy morale before any real resistance could organize. It had worked on dozens of worlds before this one. It did not work here. The moment Threll vessels crossed into range, human ground units scattered into smaller, mobile groups instead of holding a single defensive line, a tactic that confused the attacking force almost immediately. Voss Kaith's ships adjusted their targeting systems to compensate, but by the time they recalculated, the human units had already repositioned again, moving with a fluid unpredictability that made their aerial advantage far less effective than expected. I listened to Threll communications grow increasingly frustrated as their commanders realized their targeting data was consistently out of date within seconds of acquisition. Human forces were not simply reacting to attacks. They were anticipating them, shifting positions based on patterns they seemed to recognize almost instantly, as if some part of their strategy had already accounted for exactly this kind of aerial assault. On the ground, a soldier named Oliver Bramwell led one of these mobile units through a narrow tree line, coordinating with 3 other groups through a communication network that Threll intelligence had underestimated entirely. Their equipment, considered primitive by interstellar standards, proved far more adaptable than any Council report had suggested, allowing rapid coordination across multiple units without the delay that Threll systems relied on exploiting. I zoomed my feed toward the center of the engagement, where the first real exchange of firepower took place. Threll ground troops advanced in tight formation, confident that their superior weapons would clear a path within minutes. Instead, they met resistance that adapted to their approach almost immediately, human forces using the terrain itself as a weapon, forcing the invaders into narrow corridors where their numerical and technological advantage meant far less than it should have. Voss Kaith, watching from his command vessel, ordered a second wave of reinforcements, still confident that sheer force would eventually break through. I recorded his exact words during that transmission, a mixture of confusion and stubborn certainty that the situation would correct itself once more troops joined the assault. It was the kind of overconfidence I had read about in Council records describing past conquests, the assumption that any setback was temporary and any resistance would eventually collapse under continued pressure. But something in this engagement felt different from every account I had studied before. Human forces were not simply resisting, they were learning, adjusting their tactics in real time based on information gathered from the first wave of contact. By the time the second wave of Threll troops arrived, human commanders had already identified weaknesses in their formation patterns and adjusted their own positioning to exploit them. I watched Grace Whitfield, still coordinating from a command post several kilometers away, relay critical information to field units with a speed that startled me. Her voice remained steady throughout, directing resources and reinforcements with a clarity that suggested she had trained for exactly this kind of crisis long before it ever arrived. I began to understand that this response was not improvised. It was the product of systems built over generations, emergency networks and defense protocols developed specifically for moments when coordination meant survival. As the battle intensified, I noticed something else that no prior report had prepared me for. Human engineers stationed near the front lines had begun modifying captured equipment from the first wave of the confrontation, adapting fallen Threll technology for their own use within hours of acquiring it. A young technician named Alice Marsh, worked alongside a small team to reverse engineer a damaged Threll shield generator, managing to integrate a crude but functional version into human defensive positions before the second wave of the assault even reached full intensity. Nearby, a small unit led by a young volunteer named Louise Carden, the same neighbor who had organized supply routes the night before, arrived at the front, carrying additional equipment gathered from local workshops, adding one more layer of unplanned but effective support to a defense that seemed to grow stronger with every passing hour, rather than weaker. I found this detail more unsettling than any weapon I had witnessed so far. Other species conquered by the Threll in the past had taken weeks, sometimes months, to understand captured technology well enough to use it effectively. Humanity was accomplishing something similar within a single night, driven by necessity and a willingness to experiment that seemed baked into their very nature. Voss Kaith's frustration grew more evident with each transmission I intercepted. His forces, despite outnumbering the defenders and possessing clearly superior individual weaponry, found themselves losing ground steadily as the night progressed. Every tactic that had worked flawlessly on previous worlds seemed to falter here, undone by a defending force that refused to behave the way conquered species were supposed to behave. By the middle of the night, the confrontation had shifted from a simple assault into something closer to a prolonged struggle, with both sides adapting continuously to each other's movements. I recorded a moment when a Threll unit attempted to flank the human position through a wooded area to the east, only to find that human scouts had already anticipated the maneuver and prepared a counter-response using knowledge of the terrain that no outside force could easily replicate. Commander Finch, coordinating from a forward position closer to the front lines than I expected any commander to risk, made a decision that changed the shape of the entire engagement. Instead of continuing to hold a defensive posture, he ordered a coordinated push toward the Threll landing site itself, using the confusion caused by failed flanking maneuvers to create an opening in their perimeter. I watched this decision unfold with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Every council report on human military doctrine described their forces as cautious, more inclined toward defense than aggressive counterattack, especially against a technologically superior enemy. Yet here was a commander choosing the opposite approach at exactly the right moment, exploiting a weakness that only existed because his forces had already absorbed and adapted to every tactic thrown against them. The counterattack caught Voss Kaith's forces off guard entirely. Threll troops, trained to expect continued resistance rather than an organized advance, found themselves suddenly on the defensive for the first time since landing. Their confidence, so evident at the start of the engagement, began to crack under the weight of an assault they had never anticipated facing from a species they considered far beneath their own capabilities. I recorded the moment human forces breached the outer perimeter of the Threll landing site, a combination of ground troops and newly modified equipment overwhelming defenses that had been designed to repel far less adaptable opponents. Oliver Bramwell's unit led the charge through a gap created by earlier engineering efforts, using captured technology alongside their own equipment in a combination that no Threll strategist could have predicted. Voss Kaith attempted to rally his remaining forces, ordering an immediate retreat toward the primary vessel in hopes of regrouping for a controlled withdrawal, but the speed of the human advance left little room for an organized retreat. I watched his command structure begin to collapse under pressure, communication breaking down as human forces pressed their advantage with a relentlessness that matched the very aggression Council reports had always warned about, except now directed with clear purpose rather than chaotic instinct. By the time the first light of morning touched the horizon, the confrontation at Marrow Hollow had turned entirely in humanity's favor. The Threll landing force, once confident in an easy conquest, found itself fighting simply to survive, its remaining vessel damaged and unable to achieve the kind of orderly retreat that might have preserved some measure of their original strength. I transmitted every detail of this outcome back to the Council with growing urgency, knowing that whatever bureaucratic process governed their response would likely still be moving at its usual unhurried pace. Threll ground forces defeated, I wrote. Remaining vessel severely damaged. Human forces advancing on final position. Immediate guidance requested. As I sent that message, I watched Commander Finch approach the wreckage of the Threll perimeter alongside Grace Whitfield, who had left her command post to join the front lines once the outcome of the engagement became clear. Their expressions carried no triumph, no celebration of the kind I might have expected after such a decisive victory. Instead, they moved with the same focused calm that had defined their entire response from the very beginning, already discussing recovery efforts, medical support for the wounded, and containment procedures for the defeated invaders. I found myself struck by this restraint more than anything else I had witnessed during the entire engagement. Other species, upon achieving such an unexpected victory against a superior force, often responded with excessive aggression or lingering hostility. Humanity, even in the immediate aftermath of a battle they had every reason to fear losing, seemed to shift almost instantly toward order and recovery, treating the defeated Threll survivors with a measure of restraint that surprised me given everything I had read about their supposedly unstable nature. Voss Kaith, wounded and stripped of any remaining authority, was taken into custody by human forces shortly after sunrise. I listened to his final transmission before his equipment was disabled entirely, a confused and bitter acknowledgement that the intelligence his people had relied upon for this operation had been catastrophically wrong about the species they intended to conquer. I sat back in my chair as the sun rose fully over Marrow Hollow, watching human medical teams tend to their own wounded alongside captured Threll soldiers with the same careful attention, no distinction made between friend and enemy in the immediate need for treatment. It was a detail that no council report on human aggression had ever prepared me to witness, and it troubled me more than the battle itself had. For 30 years, I had watched this species through the narrow lens of old broadcasts and outdated assumptions, cataloging their conflicts as evidence of instability without ever considering that the same traits which made them dangerous to each other might make them extraordinarily capable of defending themselves against a threat from beyond their world. The Threll had assumed conquest based on incomplete information. I had assumed danger based on the same flawed foundation. As I compiled my final report on the engagement, I realized that whatever response the Council eventually decided to send would arrive into a situation already resolved, shaped entirely by decisions made by people like Edward Finch, Grace Whitfield, Oliver Bramwell, and Alice Marsh, none of whom had ever needed permission from a distant committee to defend their home. The battle was over, decided not by the intervention of any outside power, but by the very qualities that had been misunderstood and underestimated for far too long. In the days that followed, I continued monitoring the aftermath of the engagement, curious to see how humanity would handle a victory that had come at such unexpected cost. Recovery efforts began almost immediately, coordinated by a logistics officer named Margaret Blake, whose earlier detection of the original signal had already proven crucial to the timeline of the entire crisis. She organized supply routes for the wounded, arranged temporary shelter for displaced residents near Marrow Hollow, and worked alongside international partners who arrived within hours to offer additional support, a level of cooperation between different human nations that Council archives had never associated with a species so frequently described as divided against itself. I also observed something that troubled and impressed me in equal measure. Rather than treating their unexpected victory as an opportunity to seize additional Threll technology for aggressive purposes, human researchers approached the recovered equipment with a careful, almost cautious curiosity, prioritizing an understanding of its defensive applications before considering anything else. Alice Marsh, still working alongside her small technical team, spent considerable time documenting the shield generator she had adapted during the battle, ensuring the knowledge could be shared responsibly rather than hoarded by any single group or nation for individual advantage. Commander Finch, meanwhile, oversaw the transition from active conflict to careful containment, ensuring that captured Threll soldiers received proper treatment under agreements quickly drafted between military and civilian leadership. I listened to a conversation between Finch and a visiting diplomat named Henry Doyle, the same retired engineer who had offered tactical insight during the battle, now advising on how best to communicate the incident to the wider public without inciting unnecessary panic or hostility toward the defeated invaders. Their discussion carried a thoughtfulness that surprised me, weighing the value of transparency against the risks of widespread fear, ultimately choosing to share accurate information with their population rather than concealing the full scope of what had occurred. I recorded interviews conducted by local journalists with residents of Marrow Hollow in the days following the battle, capturing a range of reactions that defied the simple narrative of triumphant celebration I might have expected. Many expressed relief, mixed with a quiet unease about what this event meant for their understanding of the universe beyond their own world. Others voiced hope that this newfound awareness might eventually lead to positive contact with other civilizations, rather than continued isolation born from fear. It was this blend of caution and hope, rather than blind celebration, that struck me as the truest reflection of the character I had spent 30 years failing to fully appreciate. By the time I compiled my final account of the engagement itself, human authorities had already begun drafting internal policies for how to respond if further unauthorized incursions occurred, developing contingency plans based on lessons learned during the crisis, rather than waiting for guidance from an institution that had proven, through its continued silence, unwilling or unable to provide timely support when it mattered most. I transmitted my complete account of the engagement, knowing that somewhere in the slow machinery of council bureaucracy, my report would eventually be read, discussed, and filed alongside countless others, long after the outcome it described had already become an unchangeable part of history. 3 days after the engagement at Marrow Hollow ended, the council finally convened an emergency session to discuss the matter. I attended remotely from my station, watching the proceedings unfold on a secondary screen while continuing my regular observation duties, because no order had yet arrived instructing me to stop. The chamber where these sessions took place was unlike anything on Earth, a vast circular hall built to accommodate representatives from dozens of member species, each seated according to a hierarchy determined by seniority and influence within the council itself. I had only ever seen this chamber through archived recordings during my training, and even through a distant screen, the scale of it remained impressive, tiered seating rising toward a domed ceiling that projected a shifting map of known space above the assembly. The session opened with a formal review of my reports, presented by a mid-level administrator named Doran Velk, whose tone throughout the presentation remained carefully neutral, as if the events he described had occurred as part of a routine border dispute rather than an actual invasion of a quarantined world. He outlined the timeline methodically, beginning with the initial detection of the unauthorized Threll vessel and ending with the confirmed defeat of their ground forces, all without a single note of urgency in his voice. I watched representatives from various member species react to this presentation with varying degrees of interest. Some appeared genuinely startled by the outcome, murmuring among themselves as Velk described the speed and effectiveness of the human response. Others seemed almost bored, treating the entire matter as a minor procedural issue that required little more than a formal condemnation of the Threll's unauthorized action before moving on to other business. A representative from a species called the Orenthal, known throughout the council for their cautious and methodical approach to nearly everything, raised the first substantial question of the session. She wanted to understand why a supposedly quarantined and technologically limited species had managed to defeat a trained Threll invasion force so thoroughly, and whether this indicated a fundamental miscalculation in how humanity had been classified within council records. Velk responded with the kind of careful diplomatic language I had come to expect from administrators trained to avoid direct accountability. He suggested that the outcome might be attributed to unusual circumstances specific to this particular engagement, rather than any broader indication that humanity's capabilities had been previously underestimated. I found myself frustrated listening to this response, knowing firsthand how deliberately the pattern of human adaptability had been ignored or dismissed in every report filed before mine. A second representative, this one from a smaller species called the Mirren, spoke up with a question that finally addressed the concern that had been troubling me since the moment the engagement began. He wanted to know what the council intended to do about the Threll's unauthorized action, and whether any consideration had been given to establishing formal contact with Earth now that its existence and capabilities had been directly witnessed by an outside power. This question sparked the first genuine debate of the session, one that would continue for far longer than I expected, given the apparent simplicity of the issue at hand. Several representatives argued that formal contact should be established immediately, citing the obvious risk of leaving a capable species uncontacted and unprotected against further unauthorized incursions from ambitious powers like the Threll. Others argued just as forcefully that humanity's demonstrated aggression, even in self-defense, confirmed exactly the concerns that had justified their quarantine in the first place, and that contact should remain restricted until further study could be conducted. I listened to this exchange with growing disbelief, watching representatives debate the merits of contact, as though humanity's fate remained entirely within Council control, as though the decision had not already been made by the very people whose planet had just been invaded. Nowhere in the discussion did anyone acknowledge that Earth's own leadership might have opinions on the matter that mattered more than any Council vote. The debate continued through what would have been, on Earth, several full days of continuous discussion, broken only by scheduled recesses that seemed designed more to accommodate the comfort of Council representatives than any genuine urgency in resolving the matter. I found myself growing increasingly restless watching this process unfold, aware that every hour spent debating procedure was an hour during which humanity continued to act entirely on its own initiative, without any input or guidance from the very institution meant to oversee interactions between developing worlds and the wider galaxy. During one of these recesses, I used the opportunity to review updated intelligence on Earth's activities following the battle. What I found only deepened my sense that the Council's deliberations had already become irrelevant to the actual situation unfolding on the ground. Human scientists, working alongside military engineers, had continued studying the captured Threll technology recovered from the battlefield, making rapid progress in understanding systems that should have taken far longer to reverse engineer, according to every technological development model in Council archives. A researcher named Charlotte Vane, leading one of these efforts, had already succeeded in adapting portions of the captured propulsion technology into early testing phases for human spacecraft, a development that Council intelligence had not expected humanity to achieve independently for at least another century. I transmitted this information into the ongoing session, hoping it might inject some urgency into a debate that seemed increasingly disconnected from reality. The reaction to this new information was mixed. Some representatives expressed genuine alarm, recognizing that humanity's rapid technological absorption represented a far more significant development than the battle itself. If left unchecked, this pace of advancement could position Earth as a significant power within the galactic community, far sooner than anyone had anticipated, potentially without the guidance or oversight that the Council traditionally provided to emerging species during their early integration into wider galactic society. Other representatives, however, remained skeptical, suggesting that isolated technological progress did not necessarily indicate readiness for formal contact, and that continued observation remained the wiser course of action until a more comprehensive assessment could be completed. I found this response particularly frustrating, given that continued observation was precisely what had already failed to prevent an unauthorized invasion in the first place. As the session dragged into its final stretch, a senior representative named Halvorn Iss, one of the most respected voices within the Council, due to his decades of experience overseeing contact protocols for numerous emerging species, finally offered a proposal that seemed to gain broader support. He suggested forming an official delegation to travel to Earth, not for immediate formal contact, but to assess the situation directly and determine the most appropriate path forward based on first-hand observation rather than second-hand reports. This proposal passed with a comfortable majority, and I felt a brief flicker of relief that some concrete action had finally emerged from days of circular debate. However, that relief faded quickly when I learned the timeline attached to this decision. The delegation would require several additional weeks to assemble properly, accounting for representative selection from various interested member species, diplomatic protocol preparation, and the logistical challenges of coordinating a mission of this significance across such a considerable distance. I calculated the time difference carefully, aware of how differently urgency was measured between council proceedings and events unfolding on Earth. Weeks of council preparation translated into an enormous amount of time for a species already demonstrating the kind of rapid adaptation and advancement I had witnessed following the battle at Marrow Hollow. Whatever assessment this delegation eventually conducted would almost certainly arrive at a very different Earth than the one described in my original reports. I submitted a final message before the session formally concluded, noting my concern that any delay in establishing genuine contact risked allowing the situation to develop entirely without council input, potentially shaping humanity's understanding of the wider galaxy through incomplete or biased information gathered from whatever remained of the defeated Threll forces still present on their world. My message received only a brief acknowledgement before the session closed, filed alongside countless other observer reports that would likely receive proper attention only after the delegation's eventual arrival. I closed my console and turned my attention back to Earth, where evening had settled once again over Marrow Hollow, the wreckage of the battle now largely cleared, replaced by the quiet rhythms of a world already moving forward into whatever came next. During one of the later recesses, I found myself in a quiet corridor outside the main chamber, reviewing my notes when Doran Velk approached me directly, something he had never done during our years of exchanging formal reports through official channels alone. He asked me, with a tone that carried more genuine curiosity than his earlier presentation had suggested, whether I truly believed humanity's response reflected deliberate strategy or simply fortunate circumstance. I told him honestly that I had asked myself the same question many times over the preceding weeks, and that every piece of evidence I had gathered pointed towards something deeper than luck, a pattern of adaptability that seemed woven into the very fabric of how humans approached any serious threat to their survival. Velk seemed unconvinced, suggesting that a single engagement, however impressive, was insufficient evidence to overturn decades of established council policy regarding humanity's classification. I reminded him, perhaps more directly than my position typically allowed, that the policy itself had been built on selective interpretation of broadcasts depicting conflict, while ignoring the equally consistent pattern of cooperation and resilience that emerged whenever those conflicts turned into genuine crises. He did not respond immediately, though I noticed him making a note in his own records before returning to the main chamber for the session's continuation. The debate itself grew more complicated as additional representatives raised concerns about precedent. A cautious voice from a species called the Dovith argued that establishing contact too quickly with an unpredictable species could destabilize existing agreements among established council members, particularly those who had spent generations building careful diplomatic relationships based on predictable behavior patterns. Another representative countered that continued delay carried its own risks, noting that other ambitious powers beyond the Threll might view humanity's continued isolation as an invitation for further unauthorized incursions, especially now that word of the failed invasion had likely begun spreading through less official channels within the wider galactic community. I found this last point particularly persuasive, aware from my own monitoring that information about the battle had already reached beyond official council records, carried through informal networks that no institution could fully control. Whatever advantage secrecy once provided had already been lost, regardless of how slowly the council chose to move on formal policy. As the session continued, Halvorn Is called for a brief demonstration, requesting that I present a more detailed account of the technological adaptation I had witnessed following the battle, hoping to settle lingering doubts about whether humanity's progress represented a genuine pattern or simply an isolated achievement under pressure. I presented my findings as clearly as possible, detailing Charlotte Vane's early progress with captured propulsion systems, alongside broader evidence of rapid organizational adaptation across multiple sectors of human society. Several representatives who had previously expressed skepticism appeared visibly reconsidering their positions as the full scope of the evidence became clear. I found myself wondering, as I often had throughout this entire experience, whether the Council's careful deliberation truly served the purpose of wisdom it claimed to represent, or whether it simply provided cover for an institution unwilling to acknowledge how badly it had misjudged a species now fully capable of shaping its own future without any need for permission or guidance from a distant assembly still debating what to do about a battle that had already been won. 6 weeks passed before the Council delegation finally departed for Earth, a delay that felt almost insulting given everything I had witnessed in the time since the battle at Marrow Hollow. I spent those weeks continuing my observations, watching humanity move forward with a pace of development that only reinforced everything I had already come to understand about their true nature. During this period, I noticed a shift in my own thinking that troubled me more than I expected. I had spent 30 years believing my role was simply to watch and record, a distant observer with no real connection to the world beneath my station. But somewhere during those 6 weeks, I found myself checking my instruments with something closer to concern than curiosity, hoping that whatever came next for Earth would unfold in a way that honored what I had witnessed rather than diminishing it through careless Council policy. Human governments, working together with a coordination that surprised even me, after everything I had already seen, established a joint council of their own to manage the aftermath of the invasion. Representatives from different nations, people like Charlotte Vane and Edward Finch, worked alongside military leaders and scientists to prepare for what they now understood was an inevitable next step: contact with a wider galactic community that clearly knew about their existence and had, until now, chosen to remain hidden. I had not expected humanity to reach this conclusion so quickly, but a careful analysis of the defeated Threll vessel had revealed enough information about council structures and interstellar politics to convince human leadership that their world was no longer truly isolated, regardless of what any official policy claimed. They began preparing for contact on their own terms, rather than waiting passively for whatever the Council eventually decided to offer them. When the Council delegation finally arrived in Earth's orbit, I watched the moment unfold with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The delegation ship, sleek and imposing by Council standards, descended slowly toward the planet's surface, guided by coordinates provided through careful diplomatic channels established during the weeks of preparation beforehand. I had been granted permission to accompany this delegation as the original observer for the region, a decision that placed me, for the first time in my career, in direct contact with the very people I had spent 30 years watching from a distance. My hands trembled slightly as our shuttle descended toward a designated meeting location just outside a city called Ashcombe, not far from the site of the original battle that had changed everything. The delegation was led by Halvorn Iss himself, the senior representative whose proposal had finally set this entire process into motion. Alongside him stood several other council members, each representing different interests and concerns regarding humanity's sudden and unavoidable entry into galactic awareness. I remained near the back of our group, uncertain of my role in proceedings that felt far larger than anything I had prepared for during my years of quiet observation. When our shuttle finally landed, we were greeted not by the fearful, disorganized welcome that some within the delegation had privately anticipated, but by a carefully prepared reception led by a small group of human representatives standing with the same calm composure I had witnessed throughout the entire crisis. Among them stood Edward Finch, now representing military coordination for this historic meeting, and a woman named Charlotte Vane, whose research into captured Threll technology had positioned her as a leading voice in matters of technological exchange. I noticed immediately that their preparation extended far beyond simple diplomatic courtesy. Behind their formal greeting stood evidence of genuine strength, defensive systems visible at the edges of the meeting site, clearly designed using knowledge gained from the very battle that had brought this delegation here in the first place. Humanity had not simply prepared to welcome visitors, they had prepared to meet equals, or perhaps even something more, on ground of their own choosing. Halvorn Iss began the formal proceedings with the careful, measured language typical of council diplomacy, expressing regret over the unauthorized Threll incursion and offering, on behalf of the council, a formal apology for the failure to prevent such a violation of Earth's sovereignty. He spoke of future cooperation, of gradual integration into wider galactic society, of the careful process typically extended to newly discovered species as they prepared for eventual contact with the broader community. Edward Finch listened to this entire presentation with patient attention, allowing the representative to finish completely before offering a response that carried none of the deference I suspected many within the delegation had expected. He acknowledged the apology, then calmly outlined humanity's own position regarding what had occurred, noting that Earth had defended itself entirely without Council assistance, had recovered and adapted foreign technology without Council guidance, and had prepared for this very meeting, fully aware of exactly how much time the Council's own procedures had cost them in the aftermath of an entirely preventable crisis. I watched several delegation members shift uncomfortably as Finch continued, his tone remaining respectful throughout, but firm in a way that made clear humanity intended to approach this relationship as partners rather than subjects, awaiting guidance from a distant authority. Charlotte Vane followed his remarks with a detailed summary of the technological progress her team had achieved since the battle, careful to frame it not as a challenge to Council power, but as evidence that humanity intended to enter any future relationship with the wider galaxy from a position of genuine capability rather than dependent vulnerability. Halvorn Is, to his credit, absorbed this response with more grace than I expected from someone accustomed to far more deferential receptions during initial contact scenarios with emerging species. He acknowledged the validity of their concerns, admitting openly that the Council's process had indeed failed to provide timely protection or support during the crisis, a rare admission that visibly surprised several members of our delegation. As formal proceedings continued throughout that first day, I found myself increasingly called upon to provide context and clarification, given my unique position as the observer who had witnessed every stage of the crisis firsthand. It was during one of these moments that Grace Whitfield, who had joined the later sessions representing civilian emergency coordination efforts, addressed me directly for the first time. She asked, with genuine curiosity rather than hostility, why the Council had chosen to watch her world in silence for so many years without ever attempting contact, and why, even after witnessing an unauthorized invasion unfold in real time, the response had remained so painfully slow. I found myself struggling to offer an answer that did not sound like a hollow defense of institutional caution, because the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable than any official explanation I might have provided. I told her honestly that the Council had feared humanity, based on incomplete observations of conflict and disagreement that failed to capture the deeper resilience and adaptability underlying those very same qualities. I admitted that I myself had shared that fear for most of my career, only recognizing the truth of her species' character once I watched them respond to an actual crisis, rather than simply reading reports about their internal disagreements from a comfortable distance. Grace listened to this admission without visible judgment, though I could see something shift in her expression, a quiet recognition that the fear which had kept her world isolated for so long had been built on assumptions rather than genuine understanding. She thanked me for my honesty, then returned to the broader discussion without further comment, though I sensed that our brief exchange had left an impression that extended beyond the formal proceedings surrounding us. Over the following days, negotiations between the Council delegation and human representatives continued, gradually shifting from formal apology and cautious diplomacy towards something closer to genuine partnership discussions. Humanity made clear throughout these negotiations that they intended to enter galactic society on equal footing, offering cooperation and openness in exchange for recognition of their sovereignty and capability, rather than accepting a subordinate position within Council hierarchy as many previously contacted species had done during their own early integration processes. I watched this negotiation unfold with a growing sense of quiet pride that surprised me, given my supposed neutrality as an observer. Humanity did not ask for protection they had already proven capable of providing themselves. They did not request guidance for a technological development they were already achieving through their own determined effort. Instead, they offered partnership grounded in mutual respect, backed by a demonstrated strength that no member of the delegation could reasonably dismiss after everything we had all witnessed together. Toward the end of these negotiations, Halvorn Is extended a formal invitation for humanity to send their own representatives to the council chamber itself, an unprecedented step given how recently their existence had become known to the wider galactic community. Charlotte Vane, speaking on behalf of the newly formed human coalition overseeing this process, accepted the invitation with careful conditions, ensuring that any future relationship would be built on equal standing rather than the traditional oversight extended to newly discovered species. I found myself present during the final session of this historic negotiation, watching as formal documents were prepared, establishing Earth's recognized status within galactic society, no longer hidden behind quarantine, no longer subject to unilateral council decisions made without their input or consent. It was a moment I never could have imagined witnessing when I first sat down at my observation station 30 years earlier, believing my only purpose was to watch a distant world from behind protective glass, never expecting that world to eventually stand as an equal partner within the very institution meant to oversee its development. As the delegation prepared for its return journey, Edward Finch approached me privately, away from the more formal proceedings that had dominated our time on Earth. He thanked me for the honesty I had shown throughout the negotiation process, acknowledging that my reports, however delayed in reaching meaningful council action, had at least provided an accurate account of events as they unfolded, rather than the biased or incomplete assessments that had shaped humanity's classification for so many years prior. I admitted to him that I had spent most of my career believing humanity represented exactly the danger the Council always assumed, only recognizing my error once circumstances forced me to witness their true character directly. Finch listened to this admission with quiet understanding, then offered a response that stayed with me long after our conversation ended, noting that most civilizations, when finally tested, reveal a truth about themselves that outside observers rarely anticipate correctly from a safe and comfortable distance. As our delegation shuttle finally lifted off from Earth's surface, carrying us back toward Council space for the formal ratification of humanity's new status within galactic society, I found myself looking back at the planet growing smaller beneath us. No longer the quiet, misunderstood world I had watched in isolation for 30 years. But a civilization that had proven, through action rather than argument, exactly what kind of strength had always existed beneath the surface disagreements the Council once mistook for weakness. I began drafting my final report for this assignment during that return journey, knowing it would be read far more carefully than any account I had ever submitted before. I wrote honestly about everything I had witnessed, the invasion, the battle, the painfully slow Council response, and the negotiation that finally acknowledged what should have been obvious from the very beginning. I closed my report with a simple observation that I believed captured the entire experience more accurately than any formal analysis could. The Council did not discover humanity's strength through careful study or patient observation. We witnessed it only when circumstances forced our hand, and by then, humanity had already proven, entirely on their own terms, that they never needed our permission to become exactly who they were always meant to be. In the months that followed the formal ratification of Earth's recognized status, I requested and received a rare transfer, stepping away from my quiet post at the edge of the solar system to take on a new assignment as a liaison supporting the early stages of humanity's integration into wider galactic affairs. It was a role that placed me, for the first time in my long career, in regular contact with the very people I had once studied only through filtered broadcasts and distant sensors. I met Alice Marsh again during one of these early exchanges, now leading a growing division dedicated to responsible technological development, carefully balancing rapid progress with caution about how quickly new capabilities should be shared beyond Earth's borders. She spoke with the same quiet focus I remembered from the battlefield, though something in her manner had softened slightly, no longer burdened by the immediate weight of crisis. She told me that she often thought about how differently things might have unfolded had the Council responded even a single day sooner, and I found I had no comforting answer to offer her beyond honest agreement. Grace Whitfield, who had since taken on a broader coordinating role across multiple regions preparing for expanded contact with visiting delegations, invited me to observe a training program she had developed for new emergency coordinators, designed specifically around lessons learned during the crisis at Marrow Hollow. Watching her teach a new generation of coordinators the same calm, deliberate decision-making that had defined her own response, I understood more clearly than ever that what I had witnessed during the invasion was not an isolated moment of exceptional performance, but the visible result of systems and values built carefully over many years, ready to activate the instant they were truly needed. Commander Edward Finch, meanwhile, remained closely involved in shaping the terms of humanity's ongoing relationship with the Council, insisting throughout every negotiation that any agreement preserve Earth's right to defend itself and develop independently, rather than becoming dependent on outside protection that had already proven unreliable when it mattered most. I sat in on several of these later discussions, watching him navigate complex diplomatic language with the same steady patience he had once shown while coordinating troop movements under far more immediate pressure. Perhaps the meeting that affected me most deeply during this period was an unplanned conversation with Peter Hale, the farmer who had first noticed the Threll vessel from the edge of his field so many months earlier. He had since become something of a quiet local figure, often asked to share his account of that first evening for historical records being compiled by human researchers eager to preserve an accurate memory of the crisis. When I introduced myself as the observer who had watched the entire event unfold from a hidden station above his world, he did not react with anger or resentment, as I half expected. Instead, he asked simple, direct questions about what I had seen, genuinely curious rather than accusatory, treating our exchange as an opportunity to understand rather than a moment to assign blame. I found myself answering as honestly as I could, describing the isolation of my post, the rigid protocols that had bound my actions, and the slow, frustrating machinery of council bureaucracy that had left an entire world to defend itself without warning or support. Peter listened carefully, then offered a simple observation that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. He said that his own history was full of moments when the people meant to help arrived too late, and that what mattered most was not whether mistakes had been made, but whether those responsible were willing to learn from them honestly going forward. That conversation, more than any formal negotiation or diplomatic ceremony, convinced me that humanity's true strength extended beyond their capacity for adaptation and defense. It lived just as clearly in their willingness to extend understanding toward those who had failed them, without abandoning the clear expectation that such failures should never be repeated. As Earth's formal integration into galactic affairs continued to expand in the months that followed, I submitted a final personal reflection alongside my official duties, choosing this time to write not as a detached observer cataloging behavior from a distance, but as someone who had come to genuinely respect the world I once watched with quiet suspicion. I described the invasion, the battle, the painfully slow response, and the negotiation that followed, but I also described the small, human moments that no official report would ever think to include: a farmer's calm curiosity, an engineer's quiet dedication, a coordinator's patient teaching, a commander's steady resolve. We arrived to offer guidance to a species that no longer required it, and the only thing our delay truly cost us was the privilege of being the ones who welcomed them first, rather than the ones who simply happened to witness their strength before finally understanding it, far too late for that understanding to have ever really mattered.